So I'm Jackson. I go by Star Maps online. That's just the name under which I publish my puzzle games. I've been making puzzle games for about like 10 years now, something like that. And one of the things I've struggled with for a long time as a developer is players accidentally solving levels and feeling dissatisfied as a result. So stumbling robs the player of feeling accomplished. It feels anticlimactic. It feels unintentional. And on a deeper level, my goal as a developer is to communicate interesting ideas to the player in such a way that they feel like they've come to those ideas on their own as an inevitable consequence of whatever mechanics I've come up with. And in the process, I would hope that they would build up a deep understanding of those mechanics. And stumbling is like pretty much the worst thing towards that goal that it can happen. So I'm going to go into, first I'm going to describe the two biggest projects I've worked on, just very, very like briefly, because I'm going to be using these as examples, and building these projects is how I learned some of these lessons. Oops. So this is by Lattice. This game is on Steam. The premise is you have like a bunch of numbers and arrows, and you turn the cells on and off. And there's like a bunch of weird rules with how they work. And I'm not going to explain like all the rules, but whatever. The point is that it's just like this. I made this game in high school, mostly. So looking back at it, there's definitely a lot of things I would change. And it's probably going to be bad advertising, actually, if this is the first you're hearing of this game, because I'm kind of going to be bashing it a little bit. But it did do some things right, so I'll give it credit for that. I'll go into this game a little more in a moment. This is Starhopper. This is very in development, very work in progress. This is the game I've been working on for 2 years. So Starhopper is basically, you have a bunch of different stars. You can arrange them in like complex formations, so they like snap to these lines and everything. And there's like a ton of different types of stars, and they all have different rules, and they all behave in all kinds of weird, complex ways. And I would like to think that this game does a much better job at preventing stumbling, and I'm going to go into a bit how I did that exactly. So let's get into the meat of things. The anatomy of a stumble. So this is the biggest thing, is this first one here. I'm going to go into both of these, and then I'm going to kind of rabbit hole on a bunch of like solutions I've come up with. But the main cause I've come across is this. So by nature of some mechanic, pattern X is common. Then players can overfit by learning to just try pattern X instead of understanding why pattern X. That is, understanding the mechanic on a deeper level, which is my goal as a developer. So I'll give an example of an area that struggled with this initially in Starhopper. So this is the time warp mechanic. It's this pink and purple spiral guy. What it does, and again, you don't have to understand like any of the mechanics really to get what I'm going to get across here. But the point is that by definition of what this mechanic is, it only has an effect if it's between some star and a blinking star, which are pulsars in the game. So this is right now changing the phase of the thing that is behind it from the perspective of the first star. So again, you don't have to understand that, but the point is it only does something if it's between a star and a blinking star. So all of these levels, that's the pattern. Now, what's also common with that is, let me go into actually this level. What's common is you have the pattern of, in a lot of these solutions, this pattern will appear where you have a star, a time warp, a blinking star of a different color, and then another star of the same color of the first one. So this like 4-star pattern is just very common in a lot of the solutions, because the nature of this mechanic, like one of the most interesting things you can do with it is build things out of this pattern. And so I'll show you what a player did to this level. They went, okay, if I put this here, it makes a triangle where they're all orange on the vertices, so that looks right. There's a nice symmetry to that. And then there's 3 stars, there's 3 lines to the triangle. Let me just try this. Oh no, this line is wrong. Okay, maybe if I move this here. Okay, that's right. All right, so they've just vibe solved it completely. And yeah, I think the reason this was possible for them, and I asked them how they did it, and they were like, it just felt right. And they couldn't even articulate exactly that what they were doing was just replicating this like 4-star pattern that appears in a lot of levels. But I'm pretty sure that's what was happening, is that this pattern is just so common in solutions, or was, I've fixed it since then, but that the players will just internalize that pattern and then just try it whenever they don't have any foothold to start with. And they'll just internalize that as a heuristic and just try it when in doubt. And that is not ideal. So I'll go into one way that I have of remedying this. Have a rough plan for what the player will think and in what order. So I'll show an example of a level that does this right. That level, by the way, that I just showed has been removed from the game. I have it here for demo purposes. So in this level, I will show you approximately what every player does and what I planned for them to do. And again, you don't have to understand any of these mechanics, just, you know. So here's what often happens. Players will go, they'll all start with this, because if you understand the mechanics as players at this point in the game they will know you have to start with this. They'll go, okay, I have to maybe block that. No, that doesn't work. That doesn't look right. Let me try blocking more like putting this here. That works, but now this one's wrong, so I have to block from this. I can't put a blue one here, so I can put a blue one below it, and it can't be this one, so it has to be the X-ray. And then I have to block from this, so that looks right. And then I have to block this, and I can't put it there, so I put it here. That's correct, right? So there's a very defined sequence of deductions that I expected the player to make. And I could, if you ask me as the developer, like, how do you expect players to approach this? I have a detailed answer that I can actually test against playtests. So when playtesters play this level, I like write down like which things do they try first, and is it the order that I predicted? Now, sometimes they'll go down dead ends that don't go anywhere, or they'll like make mistakes in their deduction process and then have to go back and like retest them. But like generally, and I've tested this like rigorously, players will generally approach it in the same way. And that's really encouraging as a designer when you have players who do pretty much exactly what you would expect, because that means that what you're doing is working, right? And that's a level that pretty much no players have stumbled on. Whereas if I go back to this other level, if you ask me like, how do you expect players to solve this level? I kind of don't have an answer. Like, I like the final solution. A lot of interesting stuff is happening in the final solution, and it looks cool, but the actual solving process, there's not really a way that I expect players to deduce their way towards solving this one. So yes. One other thing I want to show, this is a level in Bilatus, which is a similar idea here. This is a level that did not get it right. When I first made this level in high school, I thought that this solution was cool, particularly because of the reason the 5 works. And again, you don't have to understand the rules here, but the point is, I thought that the 5 was like kind of interesting here, the way it's in the same group as the 6, but like the arrows like make it work anyways and whatever. So I thought this was cool. I like this solution. However, if you do this exercise, if you force yourself to think about the solving process, you immediately see problems. So what every player does, because of the nature of the numbers, by the way, everyone will start with the 1s. That's just like the easiest way to start. So people will start with the 1, they'll click this. Oh, the 5 works, right? So immediately we see a problem here, which is that this 5 is doing nothing. No matter how interesting it is that this 5 works in this way, there's like, it might as well not even be there, because you don't even have to think about it, and it just completes itself. And then people will just fall into the rest of the puzzle, and they never really have to think about the 5. So the 5 is doing nothing here. And if at the time I had gone, okay, players consistently stumble into the 5, that's a problem, and fixed that, that would have been good. But instead I was stubborn, and I was like, no, I like the solution, I don't want to change it. So that was bad. Anyway, so, okay, next point. For the reframe, I will, yeah, okay, so for reframe, it's not the patterns that are problematic in and of themselves. So In this level over here, you may notice that I purposefully, here. In this level, very few people will start by trying 2 orange stars on this part of the line. Just because if you've played the game up until this point, which players have, if they got to this level, obviously, this just doesn't feel right. A lot of players can intuit that this is just like not the right place to start. And if you were to deduce it properly, you can do it. Like the way you would do it is that this orange star will make each of these 3 incorrect, and you only have 2 stars to block. So you don't have enough, so it doesn't work. Therefore, the 2 oranges don't go there. So you can deduce it, right? But a lot of players don't even try. And I think that's just because it doesn't feel right, and they have an intuition for which kinds of things to try and which things not to. So I don't think that is necessarily a problem, because whereas in the other level, it led to a stumble, in this level, it doesn't necessarily. So that begs the question, when is heuristic use a problem? So I can give you an example from chess. If you've played a bit of chess, you might know that putting your pawns in the center of the board in the early game is generally a good idea. The point is that trying to control the center of the board is a good heuristic to follow, but the game would be boring if that always worked, because then no deeper understanding would be required. Sometimes there's positional trickery that takes a long time to build up an intuition for. Sometimes there's gambit openings where controlling the center of the board is not a priority over stopping some complex, subtle attack. And oftentimes the positional trickery won't even manifest as a piece being taken for like 5 moves. And building up an intuition for how that works is really hard and complicated. But as a chess player myself, albeit not a super experienced one, the thing that makes it most interesting to me as a game is the process of deepening and challenging those heuristics over time. So you can perpetually update and deepen those heuristics until your intuition is strong enough that you can play bullet chess with decent accuracy. Bullet chess just meaning like strict time controls. So when you have a strict time control and you're playing a game of chess, you literally do not have the time to do all of the deductions. You don't have the time to consider the whole decision tree. You just basically have to vibe it. Like you have to use your intuition. But we don't say that that's like stumbling, right? So here's my theory as to why. It is that in chess, if putting your pawns in the center of the board in the early game worked every time, then you would never have to think about it, and you wouldn't even have to use your brain, and it would just like, the game would be boring. So in this level here, the reason that this doesn't work is that every time it looks like you have to do this like 4-star pattern, like it just works. Like that heuristic is not challenged enough. So what I did is I went through some of the levels leading up to this, and I changed it such that pattern is less common, right? So I just added variety. And I still ended up scrapping the level, but even still, like before I scrapped it, I tested it after making those changes, and it actually did, like, people stumbled into it less, because this 4-star pattern was not like just always the case. So you have to add variety. Going back to here's an example from Bilatus that actually does this well. Is this one. Usually when you have a group of 3 3s next to each other, you would expect them to be in the same group just by the nature of the way that the number mechanic works. But in this level, you have to do this. That works for, this is cool for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, there's a subversion of the expectation, which is, by the way, only works because of the heuristics established in previous levels. So this level is relying on the fact that you've built up heuristics to work at all. It's also just common sense in this level particularly. But the other nice thing about this level is that in every level after this, where there are like small clusters of the same number, without levels like this to challenge that, players just immediately assume that if you have 3 3s next to each other, they're in the same group, right? And again, you don't have to understand these mechanics, but like that's, so the levels like this that challenge those heuristics are great, because every time in future levels you won't rely on those heuristics as much, which is the same as like in chess. If you want to be a good player, if someone plays a gambit opening on you, then every game after that you have to be looking out for signs of that opening, things like that. So this works both in isolation and because it improves every level after it. The last thing I want to talk about, I know I'm running short on time here, so I'll try to be fast here, is complexity in mechanics. So complex mechanics. If it is not immediately obvious what some atomic action will do, and I'll explain what I mean by atomic. If it's not immediately obvious what some atomic action will do, even after learning the rules, that's something to be careful of. So in chess, I like to think of it as a language, right? You can get fluent in the language of chess, and that's the act of getting better at chess is getting more fluent in the language of chess. So in chess, a word would be maybe a knight move. So it's like very simple. It's atomic. Like even a kid can understand how the pieces move. Now, like learning to spot knight forks and like rook pins, that might be more complicated. But that would be something more like a sentence or a phrase or a paragraph. In Starhopper, moving a star is an atomic action, right? So this would be an atomic action. And how that affects how everything else works is should be automatic, right? Now there's a couple levels here, particularly the satellite mechanic here, where this is a little trickier, right? Because in this mechanic, if I move this satellite like here, it's not like immediately obvious maybe to some new players what will happen. So that begs another question, right? How do you distinguish between mechanics that are just hard to get the hang of and mechanics that are like not fair? Because if mechanics are not fair, then people are going to sort of resort to guesswork. In this example, I think it works out because this is sort of a late game mechanic. And also the state space for these levels is large enough that if you don't have an automatic understanding of how each of these atomic actions will play out, it is literally just impossible to, like, you can't, it will take you forever to do these levels. So it's important to note that if you have a small state space, especially if that state space is made smaller by pruning of the decision tree via heuristics, as discussed earlier. If you have a small state space and you have mechanics whose atomic actions are very hard to internalize automatically, then that is kind of a perfect storm for stumbling. I've noticed you can get around it if your words are hard to understand, but you can eventually get there, right? So I, as the developer of this mechanic, I've played with this mechanic long enough that if I just like move this here, I just like know automatically, like I don't even have to think about it, how that affects everything else, right? So if it is doable eventually, that might be okay. It might just be a hard language to learn. So it's learning to distinguish between those two things. One test you can give yourself is if you're the developer and you can't predict the results of the atomic action automatically without thinking at all, that's probably a bad sign, and it means that your language isn't fair to learn. So that would be that. This is the last slide. There's only really 3 slides to this whole thing. So I'll just speed through this real quick. Quality art takes effort. That's just the reality of things. What I do is record literally every time a playtester stumbles on a level and then fix it or scrap it entirely. The fix might entail making some structural change like resequencing levels, or like I talked about earlier, like subverting heuristics can make players question those heuristics before relying on them in future levels. That might be one way to fix a level, right? Maybe you can fix a level by putting a level that challenges some heuristic right before it. You can do that. Or you can change the level itself. But you have to try things and you have to verify it with playtesters. And if you don't put in the effort to do that, people are going to stumble. And that is just what it is. You can also make mechanical changes. Like, for example, in Starhopper, if you move a star and then check your solution too quickly, there's this timer down here at the bottom that like just prevents you from spam checking. It's not a super long timer, but it's just long enough to discourage spam checking. So that would be one way that you can address it, but you have to put in the effort to make those kinds of changes. And honestly, this might be a little controversial, but I do think that if people are stumbling too much in your solutions, that's a symptom that you haven't put in the effort to prune down your puzzle pool to the best that it can be. And maybe you just haven't put in enough effort into it, because usually you can fix these things. But it is demoralizing, because as a puzzle designer, you get attached to a lot of puzzles you make, you get attached to a lot of solutions that you find cool, and you don't want to get rid of them or change them. But you have to be willing to do that. And that's nothing revolutionary. I'm not the first person to say that by any stretch of the imagination. But it is worth mentioning here. You have to be willing to cut entire mechanics. Like, I've had to cut whole mechanics because I realized I couldn't internalize the atomic actions. And as cool as the ideas were behind the mechanics, I just couldn't make it work in a way that felt like I could become fluent enough in the language to never feel like I was stumbling. Yeah, I think this is a deep topic, and there's probably a lot more you could say about it. This is just kind of my puny attempt at cracking it. But yeah, this is just what I've come up with. So hopefully that was helpful in some way. I think that's all I have. So
thanks so much, Jackson. That was actually really great. Like, this is a topic that I've thought about a lot as well, having played lots of puzzle games and encountered games where I do end up stumbling a fair bit. You do start thinking about it, like what is it that makes that happen?
yeah.
What is it that forces me to stumble, or what is it about
Yeah.
the puzzles that encourages it in some way? So it's great to have your presentation like dive into that in detail.
Thanks.
So don't worry about we started a bit late, so don't worry about the timing here. So some things have come up in chat, some questions. And actually, the first thing I wanted to bring up was that when you started the presentation, you talked about this kind of using heuristics, vibe solving, and mostly in a negative light. And I think people's reactions in the chat was, like, their immediate reactions were, some people were saying, let me try and find the quote. I think it was Vida said, I don't know that vibe solving necessarily feels bad to me. It makes me feel like I've understood something subconsciously, which feels cool.
That's 100% true.
Yeah.
And I tried to sort of like strike the balance there.
Yeah.
Like the chess example, right? When you're playing chess under strict time control, it doesn't feel like you're stumbling into solutions. Like, it's fun to play strict time control chess, even though you are kind of vibing your answers, right?
Yeah.
So what I was trying to, maybe I didn't perfectly explain it.
No, so you did, just to be clear, because that was like an initial reaction. And what I wanted to say is that you then elaborated on that in a way that I thought really.
Yeah, maybe I should have. I don't know. Yeah, but like, using heuristics is not a bad thing, and it's like completely normal. Actually, I actually think that the way that people think about puzzle games as being purely deductive processes is kind of wrong, because the actual experience as like a human brain solving anything is going to rely a lot on intuition and heuristic use.
Absolutely, yeah.
But yeah.
No, I love that aspect of your.
The point is when those heuristics never get challenged, so that you can just sort of like, you just learn the kinds of things that usually work in like a less fun way. It's hard to describe like the difference.
And I guess sometimes, and I think some of your examples covered this, sometimes when the player falls into using those heuristics, they end up missing what you actually wanted the puzzle to be about.
Exactly. Sometimes there's a lot of deep stuff, but they can just like use shallower heuristics. Like, understanding and internalizing deep heuristics is helps the player build up a deep understanding. But if they can rely on shallow heuristics, like one thing in Starhopper is often, and I've remedied this sort of, but I used to have a lot more symmetrical levels, and players would just like do the thing that looked the most symmetrical.
Right.
Like, that is a heuristic, but it's like, things that I would hope.
So this reminds me also, I've referenced this a few times now because it's the game I'm playing at the moment, but I've been playing Spooky Express. And in that, occasionally, there's a heuristic I use, which is just make the most spaghetti-like route through because you're drawing like railway tracks through the level. And the heuristic I use is, okay, let's just make it the most spaghetti-like, the most like winding path. And so it would be probably a bad thing if that worked on every puzzle, and it doesn't work on every puzzle. Spooky Express is a great game, but occasionally it does work, and there's times when I've just drawn a path and gone, oh, that actually does happen to be the solution, which is quite funny. But like, presumably the puzzle had some other thing they wanted me to be thinking about that wasn't that.
Yeah.
It's an example of that same thing. Okay, so then Vida had another question here, which is, how do you figure out whether people are purely vibe solving or whether they understand the mechanic but just don't know how to articulate it?
That is the question, isn't it? How do you understand if they're vibe solving or just, well, I mean, as the designer, you should know the deep you should have a feel for what the level of deep understanding you want to convey is.
Mm-hmm.
You should kind of know like what the idea is that you're trying to grasp at and communicate in some puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
And so like how do you know that just doing the symmetric thing isn't just intuiting the mechanics on a deep level? And it's like, because maybe I don't know how to articulate this, but you just know, like, like clearly there are deeper ideas here. And as the developer, you know what those ideas are.
Mm-hmm.
And if you could articulate them perfectly, you wouldn't need the puzzle game. But yeah, I mean, you should just kind of be able to tell if the playtesters are. That's a really hard question.
And to some degree, you did talk about this as well, because you were saying that like when they are following the kind of process you were intending for them to follow, they actually follow a different sequence of steps, right? So you can see in the sequence of steps they take.
That's I guess that'd be one way, right? Like,
yeah.
If they reliably solve it in the same way, that's one way to see if like you have your pulse on the mind of the of the solver. Whereas if they just kind of do a different thing every time, that's usually a bad thing.
Absolutely. I guess this is the fun thing about game design, is like try to put yourself in the mind of another person and what they're going to do. So I love digging into this much. I think that's everything we've had time for. So I have made. Oh, actually, I just remembered somebody said they wanted to ask a question on Discord. Did it come through? I think it came through. Apologies. Somebody said they were going to ask a question on Discord, but I've not seen it. So apologies. If you want to ask that question, just take it to the thread that I've made on Discord for this talk, and Jackson can be there. So thank you so much, Jackson, and we'll head over to the next talk.
I hope this was like organized and useful.
This is great. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Cool.